Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Joining me today is someone I've been wanting to talk to for quite some time. Her name is Elizabeth Milito. She is the Executive Director of the NFIB Small Business Legal Center. I almost called it the Small Business Legal Foundation. I know or the NFIB Legal Foundation. I know that's not its name anymore. And just for those of you who don't know, I am truly passionate about small business and entrepreneurship. And in the interest of transparency and accountability, I was at NFIB for a great 6 years, from 2002 to 2008. In fact, I worked down the hall from Beth and her predecessor, Karen Harned. So, Beth, let's talk about this. What is the Small Business Legal Center?
So first of all, Andrew, it is great to see you. And we were actually next door neighbors, I think, for office neighbors, right? Next door neighbors for maybe a good 4 years. It's great to see you again. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. So the NFIB Small Business Legal Centers, first of all, let me back up too. So the National Federation of Independent Business, need to get away from this alphabet soup, right?
Yes.
NFIB, we are NFIB. We are the nation's largest small business advocacy group, and we represent about 300,000 small businesses across the country and in all industries, every state, all industries. I always say NFIB members, as you know, Andrew, do everything, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's amazing. And the Legal Center is the voice of small businesses in the nation's court, and we also are an educational resource for small business owners. So we're kind of two hats too. I do some litigation and stuff in the courts, and then I do a lot of compliance assistance with small business owners, which, as you know, is very important.
And I want to get to that in a minute. The other great factor about NFIB is that all of its members are independently owned and operated. They're not large corporations. They're not. I guess actually I don't remember if they're franchisors. But then you get down to, we're going to talk about the franchise rule, and there are a couple of rules that are out there that we're going to get into. But the other thing is, I remember the statistic correctly, 90% of NFIB's members have 20 employees or less. So you're truly talking about the smallest of the small businesses. And rules and regulations and laws, they impact these small businesses differently. In fact, talk about that, especially with regards to the compliance assistance work that the Small Business Legal Center does.
So you are right, or say accurate in your description of NFIB members. So our average member actually probably has 10 employees or less. So we are the small. Yeah, I mean, we are the flower shop, the pizza parlor, the dry cleaner, the auto repair shop. And as I said, our members do everything. They're in every industry, but they are the small, and they are independently owned and operated. That's the only criteria to belong to NFIB. We do represent franchisees because, as many know, they are independently owned and operated. So Subway, McDonald's, Mary Maids, the list goes on and on. We do have franchisees, but by and large, our members are very small, and they do not have in-house counsel, certainly not with 10 employees or less. They don't even have a professional, dedicated human resource employee. So employment issues, like when you're hiring a new employee and all the paperwork you have to fill out, the tax forms that you have to send in, all that, who is that done by? Well, more times than not, it's the business owner or the business owner's partner, or it's the person who works in the office, who is kind of the jack of all trades. So they're the compliance officer. They're keeping up with any OSHA requirements. They're keeping up with any, tax requirements and all that. So it really is challenging for business owners.
Let's talk about this, because one of the things when I was doing regulatory work at NFIB, and I know it hasn't changed, but I want you to expound on this a little bit, is the idea of when new rules are being crafted by these agencies. OSHA, let's even just take the Department of Labor and the various subsections of Department of Labor. So you have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or you've got the Wage and Hour Division, or you've got, think about another subdivision of labor, but none of them really knows what the other ones are doing, and they don't understand that when they're adding even 15 minutes of burden to somebody's time, in terms of paperwork they need to do, they may be getting, burden from, OSHA may be adding burden here, but Wage and Hour may be adding burden there. And we seem to operate in a vacuum. They don't seem to get that. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because a lot of the bureaucrats, and I mean, frankly, a lot of our elected representatives too have never owned a small business, Andrew. That's why. That is why they don't understand. They've worked for, government agencies or bigger companies that had HR departments. I always remember when I like that you brought up the Department of Labor there, because I always remember shortly after I started at NFIB, a meeting over at the Department of Labor with the wage and hour administrator, and it was one of the deputies there who was talking about, this new, paperwork, and, well, that's just going to be handled by HR. And I remember thinking, and I'm going to tell you, Andrew, too, this was a Republican administration, too.
Yeah.
So this was a political Republican, but again, it was somebody who's never owned or worked in a small business. They've only worked in places that had an HR department. So how is
Beth,
that's going to be handled by HR?
I remember a meeting over at Health and Human Services, and it was back when the bird flu was the big thing, right? Remember bird flu?
Right.
Yeah, way, many years ago. And they were talking about, they wanted to get small business input for how they might handle a bird flu pandemic. And they said to me, Andrew, so what happens if we mandate that a business needs to be shut down for 2 weeks? I said, well, they'll go out of business. And they're like, what? I said, yeah. You don't understand. These are not businesses with massive cash reserves. And actually, Beth, with that in mind, talk a little bit about the COVID experience for NFIB's members.
I mean, that was incredible in that it showed the resilience of small businesses. Yeah. I mean, when that started in March of 2020, I started getting the calls. First of all, I should back up. Started getting calls from members on the West Coast. In Oregon, Washington, and then, because the states were shutting down first. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be bad. And I think people here in D.C. in our office here thought I was, what's the nursery rhyme? The Henny Penny running around.
Sure.
There's Beth. The sky is falling. This can't be that bad. We're going to, and then the president came out and said, we're going to shut it down, slow the curve or whatever. And I'm like, I think this is going to be pretty bad. And then it was. But, at the end of the day, they came through it. And, the creativity, the flexibility, the resilience shown by small businesses was amazing.
And some of it had to do, right, with states then being creative in terms of how they let businesses continue to do business, right? The ridiculous rules that might have been on the books. I know I was doing radio in Maryland at the time, so I got to hear a lot about some things that folks were doing in Baltimore and elsewhere in Maryland to sort of help keep these businesses open. It demonstrated that if you were a little bit more flexible with rules and regulations, you could help these businesses. On the same token, it also showed you how damaging rules and regulations can be for rules and regulations' sake, couldn't they?
That's so true, too. And I think, the restaurants, the greatest example, too, allowing the outdoor dining, too. And then, of course, I guess in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, too, we saw allowing the alcohol takeout, which was, a great, really helped a lot of restaurants, too, that relied, a lot of their income came from the sales of alcohol, and they were prohibited from carryout. So you can see how, when needed, when necessary, the government bureaucracy really could be flexible in a way. And I wish that we had seen more of that. But yeah, at the end of the day,
we are seeing the regulatory tempo increase, right, in the new administration. And again, I'm not asking you because I know the Small Business Legal Center is a 501c3 organization, so you're not picking and choosing legislation, you're not choosing candidates, but we know that the regulatory tempo is increasing. What are you hearing concerns-wise from NFIB's members and other small businesses you might talk to about what they're concerned about coming down the pipeline? Something for both at the federal level, but also at the state levels. And
that's a great point about the states too, because when I was first at NFIB, we had so much focus, and you were a regulatory affairs guy, Andrew. You were outstanding, and fighting back the federal regulatory beast, if you will. And now more and more states are getting in the game. So you had the federal wage and hour law, and now you've got more and more states enacting wage and hour laws and restrictions and benefits and those sort of things too. So, I don't know if you coined the term death by 1,000 cuts.
Oh, yeah.
But, that is so true.
I don't know if I termed it, but I know the other folks, we've all used it, but that's the way it is, right? And for those of you who are watching and listening, what we're talking about here is that when you have a small business, and we can get into, I like to talk about regulatory burdens in terms of both time and money, because time is the only thing you can't make more of. But it's like every little bit here, as I've said, in the past, every hour of time that is taken away from a small business's productive time is essentially 1/8 of a day, which is 1/2% of that small business's productive time, right? Depending on how you look at it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, all of this stuff adds up down the road. Let's go here and let's talk about what you are hearing though. I mean, what's on people's minds as they contact the Small Business Legal Center?
So it's a lot of uncertainty, and
yeah.
Uncertainty over what's coming down the pike and how enforcement's going to fall out with the rules that are on the books too. So for instance, we saw in the news too how the IRS got more money for enforcement. So we've had a lot, they're going to hire more agents to, scrutinize business taxes. Well, that just is a lot of uncertainty for small business owners who already taxes, going back to the point of, they don't have an in-house, accountant there. They've got the person in the office who does the books.
Right.
And they may have an accountant file their annual taxes, but, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm not sure all my I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And now there's even more likelihood that I'm going to be audited. What is this going to cost? And it's just very frightening for a business owner.
And we know from that one example, there was that great video out there, the IRS trying to justify the need for more enforcement. They said, we're only going to go after the truly wealthy, X, Y, and Z. But then who were the example that the enforcement agents were being told was a small business landscaping company. And it underscored that really this is what was in their sights is these small business owners. I want to take a step back for a second because the Small Business Legal Center, formerly the NFIB Legal Foundation, celebrated its 20th anniversary recently. Let's talk a little bit about some of the high points. It was one of those things where, and again, your predecessor, Karen Harnage, she and I started, I think, on the same day in 2002. And founded by a friend and mentor of mine, and I know a friend of yours, Tom Sullivan. That organization grew and had some amazing experiences. Talk about some of the highlights of those 20 years, because listen, not that you look at, but you and I have both been a part of this for a very long time. Talk about some of those successes over 20 years, or some of the highlights, I should say.
Yeah, I was going to say, because certainly I think our highlight was our NFIB versus Sebelius, our challenge
Absolutely.
to the Obamacare, and unfortunately we can't term it a success, maybe. I mean, it was, but that definitely, we really took a stand there. We were the only business group willing to go out there and sue over the law. We were not hesitant at all. Our members were all in and supporting that. So that for me was definitely the highlight of the 20 years. I think more recently, our challenge to the vaccine mandates, or lawsuit in 2021 challenging the private sector vaccine mandate requiring that employers have their employees vaccinated or tested, and that we got that decision just this year. And that again was something where we were out there willing to take a stand when some other business groups were a little bit more hesitant, like, oh, this is kind of divisive and not willing to take the heat. And our members were again all in. This is something you need to do.
I remain enormously proud of my time in affiliation with NFIB. Those two cases made me especially proud that I could say that I did that. Again, not to sort of blow smoke and sort of lend be anyway. Truly proud.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that NFIB really has done well over the last 20 years, and this is going back to your role there too, has worked in all three branches of the government too.
Yeah.
So it's not just, we're focused only on the Hill and the legislation. Your role is so critical too, fighting, the bad regulations, the rules, where the rubber meets the road, if you will.
But let's talk about the relationship between the two, right? Because you can't challenge a regulatory decision unless you filed comments on it. Talk about that kind of work that NFIB is doing and sort of sussing out what the members believe. By the way, folks, if you don't know, NFIB is a member-driven organization. They poll their members on issues and get their members' reactions to things. Sometimes it can be a time-consuming process, but it's very important. But talk about that in terms of the relationship between the regulations as proposed, and we're going to get into some specifics, and then the challenges that can be filed if the final rule is not up to what the NFIB members want it to be.
Right. No, and that's, kind of going back to elementary school where the bill becomes a law and then the law
Sure.
becomes a rule. And then, worst comes to worst, that's where the legal center comes in and we challenge. So the middle component there were the regulations. So Congress passes a law, and sometimes, at NFIB or other associations, you fight against something. And it
Yeah.
goes, it gets passed. And then that's where it is so important for an advocacy group like NFIB to come in and watch carefully and then comment on and engage in the rulemaking process. So how is EPA going to, how is this law going to play out with EPA's rule? How are they going to enforce it? How many, enforcement agents are they going to put on the case? Are they going to set up a compliance office? Is there going to be somebody dedicated there to help take calls from small business owners? All those sort of things are things that NFIB and other advocacy groups can weigh in during the rulemaking process.
Let's talk about some of the recent rules and rulemakings you've been involved in. So we had the most recent one, which is this under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the gig economy rulemaking, which has its roots in California's AB 5. It's not the same thing. It's not quite structured the same way, but nevertheless, it has the same intent. Talk about why this is so important to small business and NFIB's involvement in this and where you see it going.
Well, independent contractors are, first of all, many small business owners started off as an independent contractor, right? They started off as a consultant. They had one
Sure.
client. That's how they got into business for themselves and went out on their own. And then actually not a lot, I don't know a small business that doesn't use independent contractors, hires them because, you talked about too, the resources that small business owners don't have. They can't afford to keep a small retail shop, a website designer on staff. They just need,
Right.
Bob, their website designer, to come in 1 or 2 times a month to update the website there. So they use independent contractors all the time. So it's very important that we have a good, firm grasp as to who is an employee and who is an independent contractor, and that the law works, the definition works in such a way that it's flexible enough for small businesses to engage contractors when they need to do so, and that not everybody is classified as an employee. It's just not workable in our economy. And we saw in California, they went too far and then they had to come back with all these exceptions now.
Sure. Do you have any idea how many small businesses are impacted? I mean, we could say all of them, the millions of tens of millions of small businesses that are out there. But any idea of numbers-wise how big the universe is?
I don't have offhand a number of you, but I know just in talking with members, and polling our members too, the use of consultants, and again, you're outsourcing more. Like
Right.
here we are, social media, all those that now businesses need to do. The website is the greatest example there too. But payroll, if you're a contractor too, you might outsource certain specialized, tile work. You only hire when you do a high-end bathroom. You only need this high-end tile guy when you're doing these high-end bathrooms. So
Sure.
not somebody you're going to keep as an employee, year round. So it does come up, and more times than not in a small business.
So this other one that caught a lot of people's attention is this joint employer rule. I know very important to NFIB's franchise members. Talk about that proposal.
Right. So the joint employer proposal is coming from the National Labor Relations Board, and it would make it more likely that 2 businesses who work with, an employee, a worker rather, would both be liable for employment law violations. And it comes up in the franchisor franchisee, but it also comes up in the contractor, subcontractor
Sure.
context too. So, let me use the example of Walmart.
Please.
Walmart outsources its landscaping at many of its stores there. So the landscapers are contractors for Walmart.
No.
How likely is it now that Walmart is going to exert more control over the contractors because they're concerned about labor violations? Is it likely in situations like that larger companies are going to say, you know what, too much risk working with these little small guys. They don't have enough policies, procedures. We're just going to bring it all in-house.
And to make it sort of give a practical example, using that example, right? So if Walmart employs a landscaping company on a contract basis, and let's say that one of the employees in the landscaping company is injured because of an OSHA violation, The question becomes, is the contractor that owns the landscaping company liable for the OSHA violation, or is it Walmart? And we both know that they're going to want to go after Walmart because they've got the deeper pockets, right? That's
Yes,
really what we're talking about here.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. So,
Yeah.
Walmart's going to look at this and go, gee, we really need to exert more control over our contractors. Now, anyone who wants to contract with us is going to need to do A, B, C, D,
Sure.
E. And it gets to the point too, Andrew, where then it's not going to be small contractors, small landscapers. It's going to be some, big operation, multi-state operation. Nothing against a larger landscaping business. But, we want to look out for the smaller guys, again, that are just getting started, that maybe just operate in, one town or one city, and aren't necessarily going to have all these policies and procedures, and not necessary either.
It's interesting because we know that, in Washington and the variable sides of this, there are sides that claim to be anti-major corporate interests and pro-small business, but in the end, they engage in policies that wind up favoring those big employers in a way. So, you like this rule, some of the COVID policies that were out there, right? The big box retailers that got to stay open when the small businesses stayed closed. A lot of the work you guys are doing is peeling back that myth, isn't it?
Right. Because a lot of these policies are boxing out the small businesses, the small mom and pops.
So part of the reason why I wanted to have you on is that you guys just filed a friend of the court, an amicus brief in this. I have to look down at my notes here because I want to make sure I get the name. The Glacier Northwest versus the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Talk about that case you filed the friend of the court brief in.
Right. So this pertains to damage allegedly caused by some striking workers at a cement plant in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State there. The union called a strike. The workers left the cement trucks full of cement, walked off the job. And the question becomes, is the company, the employer, permitted to sue the union for all the loss of this concrete? Lots of money at stake there. I mean, and the company did all it could to kind of get the machines going with the managers that were on site there, but when you've got all your workers going off there. So it's a question as to whether or not sort of a property rights claim can be exerted against you. And of course, we're arguing in this instance, yeah, absolutely. It's not unreasonable for a company to be able to recover damages in an instance like this.
It's good stuff, and that's on the docket for this session. So
Yes.
We'll have a decision later on this year. You guys have any other amicus briefs you're getting ready to file?
Let's see. Coming up this term, we are waiting and you would be interested in this, Andrew, too, because you used to cover environmental issues. The Sackett case. So Chantel and Michael Sackett. This involves the waters of the U.S. and EPA's authority. Yes, this is a big one, and I think this probably it was argued in the fall. Probably will get a decision, as a more controversial case later.
Are we ever going to have any kind of certainty when it comes to this waters of the U.S. issue, or is it going to continue to go back and forth? For those of you who don't understand, the Clean Water Act of 1972 says you can't pollute a navigable water of the United States. And because Congress didn't define what pollution is or navigable or water of the United States is, it leaves it to the agencies to determine what it is. And this issue of what is a water of the United States has been a real football over the last 30 plus, since I've been involved in these kinds of issues. Ever going to get resolved, do you think, or no, it's just going to keep going back and forth?
I think it's probably somewhat going to keep going back and forth. The EPA just released another rule on the waters of the U.S. in December. And this was, of course, everybody was like, why are you doing this? You've got to wait till the Supreme Court rules on Sackett. This case was argued. Why are you, so it really is, again, adding to the uncertainty of, any farmer, contractor, small home builder. It's like, when am I going to need to get a waters permit? And they're expensive to get, as you know, because you used to write our comments on the WOTUS rule.
Well, it's a situation where really, folks, this is about land. It's never really about environmental issues. It's really about land use control. The same thing with the Endangered Species Act. And the onus becomes on the property owner because they have to essentially admit that what they're doing is going to harm the environment. And if you have to admit that you're going to do something to harm the environment, then the government is predisposed to deny you permission to do whatever it is you want to do. We could spend hours doing this, Beth. Listen, I ask everybody this. I should have let you know about this before I came on. and I'll tease it this way. So at one point I was contemplating doing a podcast called Outside Interest. And the idea was to talk to folks who are involved in politics and policy about things that they do that are of interest to them outside of politics and policy. Right? The idea is to sort of get a little, so talk about when you're not doing the work of the Small Business Legal Center, what is it that you're interested in? What are sort of your outside interests?
I'm mom of 4, so that's going to be my first thing on my mind there.
Sure.
So my kids and my family and my church are probably the big ones there. And I love to read too. So, and that was something that was a COVID thing that I made a commitment to start reading more. Get off the Netflix binges, and I've held to that too. So yes, I've been reading a lot more books, real books too. I'm not a Kindle person, so.
Oh, see, I like having my Kindle, but and it has been helping me read more in that way. Let me ask you this, because we can get into this, and I don't know that you and I have ever talked about this. Before you came on board in NFIB, I mean, had you been passionate about small business issues? How did you get interested in these kinds of things?
So my background was actually in labor employment policy.
That's right.
and defending employers too. So I had, that was where I came into NFIB. So it was not small business necessarily, but it was defending employers. So that's why I have a special interest at NFIB in the labor and employment, issues.
I don't know if I told you, but the very first job I had, I worked for a couple of employer-side labor and employment lawyers, and then I moved on to doing the environmental stuff. So, well, Beth Milito, the executive director of the NFIB Small Business Legal Center, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for having me on.
You're welcome, and thank you all as well for joining us today. I'm Andrew Langer. This has been the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.